That's gone. I read in an article in the newspaper there that he made so many recordings in London, and he played in so many venues in addition to the Mayfair, that the British musicians dragged him in court for unfair labor practices. And the judge found 4 musicians and limited his playing to only the Mayfair.
That is exactly right, yeah. The British Musicians Union banned him from playing. And there were 4 musicians, and they were all trumpet players, strangely enough. They got together and had him banned. And up until pretty close to the day he died, he would never tell anybody. He knew who they were, but he never mentioned them. Now, that's a gentleman. And he wasn't bitter about it. He said, that's the way it was. I was in their country, and someone come over to America that just blew the pants off of everybody else, they probably would have done the same thing. So, yeah, that's true.
When you met him, was he at that time playing still, or was he near the end?
He was pretty much retired, but he still played at home.
Still played at home.
He had a sound that was like a crystal bell. One of the most beautiful trumpet sounds I've ever heard. And just as an aside, there was a trumpet teacher, then a cornet teacher in Boston named Walter Smith. And who he took from Walter Smith, who turned out some of the New England's finest players. It was a sound that was called the Boston tone. And you can't really describe it. You have to hear somebody like Louis do it. Unfortunately, I can't produce it on that little thing. But it's a very distinctive, clear, beautiful, penetrating sound. It's not loud. He could be heard miles away, but he wasn't a loud player. And that's another part of his professionalism. When they played at the Mayfair, it was a restaurant as well as for dancing. So they played for 2 hours for food, and people would be sitting and eating. And they had to play what he called piano volume. So if anybody in the band was playing and couldn't hear the piano, they were too loud. So a piano is not an overly loud instrument, and if you've got people eating and talking, and you've got a 10-piece band sitting there playing, they couldn't have played loud. So he could control his instrument. Playing soft on one of these things is harder than playing loud. Anybody can play loud that's good enough to be a professional. But to play soft and quietly in those situations, so he could play almost inaudibly if he had to. Anything else?
Scott, is that trumpet play? Or not? Or is it
It does play. I'm going to be playing that horn in a couple of weeks. I get talked into doing Ahola-like solos. So I've studied his style, and I can approximate the way he played his jazz. His jazz was very typical of the 1920s. There were some very fine players that played very similarly. But if you put them up beside him and listen to his solos, he was actually more inventive than a lot of the people that are famous. Red Nichols, for example, played very much in the style of Hooley. But he didn't have quite the, there's a cut that he did almost at the end of his tour in England. And people who didn't know, that heard the thing here, thought it was Louis Armstrong. Now, it really didn't sound like Louis Armstrong, but there were a couple of ideas that he produced that you say, well, Louis probably would have done that. So he was always moving on. He was always inventing. He was always getting better. But again, the music that he left us, by today's standards, is very, very archaic. It's old. But in his day, that was a rock musician. Really, it was the pioneering music of that era. So he was playing the hot dance style of jazz. That's why England had to have it. And America lost probably 4 years of what he might have done here to become an even better jazz player. But because of the constraints that he had, you could only play for 3 minutes on the 78. And that was it. So that's why you only get 16 bars here, or maybe you'd never got the whole song. And it was usually taken up by some schmo that was singing, that couldn't sing, that belonged to somebody in the band. Usually the record producer's brother, sister, aunt, was the one that did the singing. And the British vocals are really pretty hard to take. You probably heard as it came in. So anyway, if there's nothing else, I will shut up.
Could you just give us a little sample?
Could you contrast the trumpet with the...
I can't, because that mouthpiece is
not yours.
Hooley's mouthpiece.
Okay.
And it's the size of a pin.
Okay.
I can give you a little more on this.
Scotty, do you have a mouthpiece in the car?
I don't have a mouthpiece in the car.
Do I have
I wasn't
a
planning on
mouthpiece?
playing. So this is on, it's on an 1883 mouthpiece. tropical sounding thing. It sounds a little bit like a cornet, but it's difficult at best. His style of jazz playing is based on syncopation. So if he's doing a solo, that would be based on what he played, the style of the solos. It was very kind of rollicking, very punchy, if you will. So I think that's the best I can do with this thing. So thank you all.
Oh, I'm so impressed.
Don't be.
I'm going to ask Wally McGrath to speak, but I want to tell you that when my son was my oldest, you know Jeffrey Steele, now classical guitarist, was taking up the trumpet at the age of 8. I took him and his brother up to visit Sylvester and Simon, and Sylvester got all his horns out, and he played everything, and the drum set, and his other passion, which was radio, short range, what do you call it? Ham radio. Years later, Jonathan came and walked into the house, my second son. He said, "This has gotten smaller." I remember as being full of drums. Anyway, Sylvester was like that. He was so generous and so willing to share himself. Okay, I'm going to ask Wally to talk a little bit about his recollections.
That's you.
Personal experiences.
Well, hand me my trumpet. Actually, I play a clarinet, and so that's a little bit different. So I have played with Sylvester Ahola, but I'll go back a little bit. That I was born in Rockport in 1933 and moved to Lanesville in 1939. And about that time, there were about at least 6 dairy farms in Lanesville, this being one of them. So at the time, I was in this just about the time that they closed. And so that it was the beginning of not really knowing Sylvester Ahola and the Hula Farm. But 1947, there's a picture over there with my uncle with Sylvester Ahola and in a tuxedo in 1945. Well, he took me to Rockport, and that's how I started to learn to play the clarinet. And he taught me the clarinet, and the Rockport Legion Band, which I'm still a member of, we came over here and we played at the Congregational Church. And Sylvester played there, and also there's Jake Knutson and there's Bill Johnson, Jake Knutson was also a very fine trumpet player, and I think he might have played with the Boston Symphony. And they also played a trio together, which was very unusual. They were very accomplished musicians. And also in that band, which is interesting when you mentioned the Erkeles, Sonny Erkele was in that band and solo Erkele. On these 5, the Erkeles, one played the clarinet, the other played the trombone.
What about Andy Jacobson?
What's that?
Andy Jacobson?
Well, at that time, Andy Jacobson, that's a whole different story. He played with John Philip Sousa, and that's a whole different thing than what I'm going to talk about. I could probably. But anyhow, the thing was, what story I want to mention about Sylvester. Well, first, let me tell you, the company I worked in Waltham, and I've been retired over 20 years, there was a musician, there was an engineer there who came from the South Shore, and I mentioned Sylvester Ahola, and he said, I know him, I heard of him. They play him on the South Shore. And went down there, they were comparing him with Harry James, to give you an idea of the level of that this player really was. And a lot of people in Lanesville probably never really knew the level of what he did. But I'll go back to the Legion Band. Now, one night we had an old-timers night, and this is the story I want to kind of tell because it's interesting. And there was a trumpet player called Freddie Kajeski, who was a good trumpet player. And he was there, and he heard all about Sylvester. But when I was thinking of Freddie Kajeski, I was thinking, he's thinking that nobody can be that good. So he happens to get over by Sylvester. And he says that he is going to be playing the solo. And Sylvester said, well, what is that solo? And he said, well, it's the Flight of the Bumblebee. So Sylvester said, hand me my trumpet. He picks the trumpet up, and he proceeds to play the Flight of the Bumblebee. And he does an amazing job. But the next thing he does, he says, now I'm going to impersonate how other people play them. And that's what he does next, and he plays that, because I think what he was doing in England even was that trumpet players, he would change his style and play the second part, which was kind of unusual that he would do that. But he also, when you see the picture of the Wayno Hall, he played in the Wayno Hall. And it was interesting tonight when I was talking with Carol Russell here, and I was there when the Wayno Hall burned down, and so was she. And she's claimed that they kind of let him out of school to go see that, and I remember being across the street and the flagpole kind of dropping down, and that was kind of the end of the Wayno Hall, in the band. But that's my story about Sylvester Ahola. Unusual, great tone. I don't think I've ever heard anybody duplicate that sound that he had, okay?
I'd like to hear from some of the rest of you.
Which is not going to get you.
There you go.
I can do it. I need that for everybody. Okay, I have a little bit of different perspective on Sylvester. By the way, my name is Leo Capillo. I'm a cover, pigeon cover that is. Used to be anyway, I live in New Hampshire now. But I was born and raised down here. During my teenage years, I got to know Sylvester when I decided to take up drums. And I had two drum teachers. One was Russell Scatterday, who was in Rockport. I think some of you might remember him. And Sylvester. Two different characters. I liked them both. I had good experiences with both. But Sylvester was special, and I'll tell you why. He would give me an hour lesson, but he would break it up in probably 3/4 of an hour, because he always saved the last 10, 15 minutes to give me something on the trumpet. And I remember going over to the house, the big room, I think you all remember the big room he had. And what's his wife? Simon would come out, and she said, Sylvester will be right out in a minute. Well, he'd come out and he'd have his robe on like he's going to give me a concert or something. And we'd sit down and we'd do the drum lesson and all that. And then at the end, he would always give me 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes on a trumpet. You saw some of the pictures over here of the garden hose with a funnel and a mouthpiece. I don't know how he ever played it, but he did. And you couldn't tell, I can't tell, you probably could, the difference. But he really could play that. Another one was just a mouthpiece itself. He could play that. A shell. He could play the shell without a mouthpiece. I mean, it was incredible, the things he would do. Every night that I was there, or every session that I was there, he would have something different to show me. Well, that was one part. The other part was his ham radio experience. He got me interested in ham radios also, because he had a separate room filled with all kinds of electronics, and he would bring me in there and say, okay, we're going to call this guy over in Europe or someplace, and I want you to talk to him. Well, I'm sitting there. I says, okay. So he got me interested in that. He was also part of what they call the Barnyard Net, and that was on every, I believe, Saturday mornings at 11 o'clock. And I had my mother go out and give me a shortwave radio so that I could tune in and listen to Sylvester on his Barnyard Net. Well, I never got my license in the early days. I do now, but in the early days, so I never got to enjoy it. But his call sign was W1PU. Boy, did he ever get razz on that one. He had a story, but I don't remember what the story was. W1PU. And I think to this day, it is still registered to his name, because I don't think they gave it up to anybody else.
If you one perch on Friday, you always called it.
Pardon me?
They always called it one perch on Friday.
Yeah, they had all kinds of different names for it. Some I won't mention. The other story that I have, which you probably knew or didn't know, was I used to be the disc jockey in Rockport back in the late 50s, early 60s. And Sylvester got interested in doing it. He provided
the speakers, the turntable, the amplifiers, and all of that. And we got together, and we did it for about 3 or 4 years together. In the wintertime, it would be at the Finnish American Club in Rockport, which is not there anymore, and then the Rockport Art Association in the summertime. And we would pack both places every Saturday night. But the best part was, they always wanted him to play. We could do the jitterbug, the stroll, the this and that, but during the intermission, he had to get out there and play, and they insisted on it. And that's how popular he was, even with the young people. And he used to love it. On nights, the other thing that I remembered about Sylvester, after the record hops, he had a '58 Chevy wagon, and he would pack everything into that wagon and pick me up in Pigeon Cove on the way to Rockport. And I remember those cold nights where after the record hop at 11 o'clock, we'd get into his car, and because it wasn't warmed up or anything, so as soon as we packed up the car, it would just fog up. And you know the old systems, you just can't turn on the defroster and it's going to be instant like it is today. We waited for maybe 5 minutes, and then he'd get impatient and say, "We gotta go." And I said, "Sylvester, we can't see." "It's okay, we're gonna go." And he'd rush out the window. Well, luckily, I'm only about 2 minutes away, so he could drop me off. But yeah, he just couldn't wait for it, and I remember that. One last story that I have, I worked for a company in New Hampshire. It used to be Sanders, that went to Lockheed, now it's BAE Systems. I had a gentleman that was part of the machine shop that used to do odds and ends for me. And we got talking one day about, where you're from and all that stuff, and I told him originally from down here, and he said, "Gee, I knew a guy down there that I never met him or anything, but I followed his music, and his name was Sylvester Ahola." And he says, "Oh, God." I said, "I knew Sylvester." So I told him all these stories about Sylvester, and he finally, he never met Sylvester. He did buy his book, but he had a lot of his records. He was like Sylvester. I don't know if you ever went into Sylvester's basement at his house, but he had all kinds of old Victrolas and all these machines that he used to have. And this guy had the same thing. He had all these old machines, and he had all a bunch of 78s. Most of them were Sylvester. He just followed Sylvester, and he never met him, and he just couldn't get over that I knew him, and we shared a lot of stories. So anyway, that's what I had to say. Back to the disc jockeying. We did the Finnish American Club and the Rockport Art Association. One time, he called me up and said, "We got a date for whatever."